AdvoKAYte, holding healthcare accountable. This podcast is my way of sharing what I've learned about the mistakes, the cover-ups, and the ways we can all protect ourselves. We're all in this together. Welcome back to the AdvoKAYte podcast. This week I am honored and privileged to have my dear friend Ann Roberts as our guest here today. Ann is a wealth of information, and you're going to really enjoy learning everything she has to tell us.
Thanks, Kay. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to participate in this new venture that you're on.
Well, we couldn't do it without you. So, Ann, first of all, just introduce yourself to our audience, who you are, what you do.
Sure. So I have been doing credentialing and peer review and working with large academic medical centers and for 29 years. So I'm starting to age myself. But my primary role, and I've also been a consultant for over 25 years. So I've worked with small rural hospitals to some of the largest healthcare systems in the nation. And in my role, I start with everything from training physician leaders on how to improve recruitment practices to make sure they're selecting highly qualified candidates. And then helping them onboard. Credentialing is a huge piece of what, onboarding a physician is all about to make sure they're qualified and competent. Peer review, of course, overseeing their clinical practice on an ongoing basis. And so I work with systems across the nation on how to develop best practice in those areas. And, I've, somewhere in there along those 29 years decided to throw law school on top of it because I've worked with attorneys so closely, throughout my career. And, it just was the logical next step in my career. So.
Right. Well, so, some people might think that we're kind of unlikely friends and colleagues because, we all know you wear the dark hat and I wear the white hat, right?
Well, the dark side is, a common joke, of course, but, I just say we're both on the side of the patient safety. So
that's exactly right. And you knew I had to have an opportunity to kind of gig you about that a little bit. But seriously, we met 10 years ago or so, and I'd love for you to tell that story about why you decided to reach out to me and all that.
Absolutely. Well, I think anyone who works in our field, in credentialing and peer review, were outraged, hearing the doctor death case. And I knew that you were leading a lot of the efforts to help the patients that had been harmed. And in reading some of the work that you were doing and some of the interviews, I knew that we shared the same passion for patient safety. I knew that we were going to be on the same page and that we were both outraged. How could this happen? And what can we do to prevent it from happening in the future? And so reaching out to you, I knew that, we might be two small little firecrackers that we were going to be able to really accomplish great things partnering together. So,
well, but Ann, you know that I'm sarcastic, and I would say, but Ann, your job is to protect the hospital from people like me.
So I like to say, I have different hats, right? And so no matter what hat I'm wearing, it is for patient safety. And so I think in that world, we're both on the same page. So people like you are looking after the safety for patients and trying to make things better for patients and helping them. Just as in a hospital setting, we're doing the same thing. We want what's best for patients. We focus every single day on what we can do better, how we can improve practices to ensure that we are delivering high quality patient care in every way that we can. And so in both regards, regardless of what setting you're in, it's about patient safety. So.
Well, you work for a very good hospital system.
I do.
And we know that not all hospitals or hospital systems have the same culture of patient safety as your organization does. And so let's kind of break it down a little bit about, I'd like to explore some of these things about how it should be, what safe hospitals do, and where the problems are, because we know not all hospitals do care about patient safety like you do and your organization does. And so the two areas that I want to focus on today are credentialing and peer review. So for our audience who may be new to this, let's begin by what is credentialing?
Sure. So credentialing, in a broad sense, is that whenever you're bringing on a new practitioner, a new physician to your medical staff and joining your hospital and allowing them to treat patients, there is a thorough vetting process called credentialing. And that entails a significant deep dive into each of the physicians or practitioners' background, evaluating and verifying directly with the source that they have completed the education, the training, all of the work history they have, reaching out to the other hospitals or medical groups they've worked with, determine whether they've had any quality concerns, do a comprehensive criminal background check, peer references. There is a broad scope of a ton of things that we verify during credentialing. They have very heavy regulations in regards to the things that must be verified. And then you have what we call red flags. And if something stands out in any way, shape, or form, we dive in really, really deep. We even do, deep dive Google searches with some AI technology behind it and so forth, so that we can really get a great picture of this practitioner to confirm that they are qualified and competent for the privileges that they're requesting, for the type of patient population they're going to be treating when they enter into an organization. And so if they're an anesthesiologist, for example, you want to see that they have, the appropriate training, the education, did they do well during their training program? Have they become board certified? Have they taken care of that level of patients, acuity in which your hospital that they're going into is the same setting in which they've had experience, so that that they're coming on board with the right level of experience to treat the patients at your organization.
So, I have a law firm, and so we interview candidates. We're trying to fill a position or whatever. And I always say, we don't want any job hoppers.
Yep.
Or, we look at somebody's resume and we're like, well, hold on, that's weird. They had a big gap from this job to that job. I wonder what was going on. And so, when you talk about there's certain red flags, I'm sure there's some general red flags like that, but what are the kind of things that would pique any, medical staff services credentialing person to go, whoa,
yeah,
that's needs to be looked into?
Oh, absolutely. So we do, of course, some pre-screening, and we encourage chairs and chiefs with some basic interview questions to, like, how are they board certified? Have they had issues, concerns? But red flags, while you're processing the credentialing and when you're digging into the physician's backgrounds, you're looking at have they had any disciplinary or corrective action taken by a state board, any disciplinary corrective action at a hospital setting. So those are two of your big ones. You're looking at their malpractice claims history. What does that look like? Are there patterns? Are there trends? Are there high payouts? You're looking to make sure that what they're disclosing to you aligns with the information that you're getting from other parties. So if they're giving you dates that they've worked at some hospitals, do they align? Sometimes they don't disclose all of the states where they've had state licenses, but you can run a query that has all state licenses on there. And so if they didn't list it, that's a red flag. You want to dive in and say, okay, well, you had a state license in New York. What were you doing during this time frame? Why did you have that license? And why did you not disclose that? Also, one of the big things is a clinical evaluation. So if they just complete a training, the director of the training program will complete a clinical evaluation. And they have what's called the ACGME, 6 clinical competencies, where they rate them on everything from communication, patient, care, coordination, and so forth. And we really hone in on how they're rated there. And a lot of the times, that's where you're going to get a lot of the key information of whether or not they had concerns with interpersonal communication skills, medical knowledge. They get a copy of the privileges, and they're going to say, yes, they have the education and training to perform these procedures. Or, if they've worked at another hospital, same thing. The chair there will do that evaluation and evaluate, yes, they're qualified, competent. We had no issues or quality concerns while they worked here. So it really is a deep dive in looking at things like that. And anything that is rated low, gaps in time, for example, is it because they were released from a position for cause and maybe they're still under investigation and they're looking for another position while this lengthy hearing process is ongoing? That's another flag. penalties from state medical boards, does it align with what they're telling you happened? For example, if they say, well, I was delinquent in one medical record, I disclosed that, I confirmed that, yes, I was delinquent during one medical record. But then you see a $25,000 penalty. You're like, okay, it's not quite a line. And so you have to really read between the lines and put those puzzle pieces together. So.
Right. Yes. It's like pleading to a lesser included offense in the criminal arena.
Absolutely.
But 3 things. You're going to query the medical board, you're going to query the data bank, and you're going to query the medical chief or the director of the residency program if this is their first hospital and they haven't had, and this would be the doctor who would have the most knowledge about that area of specialty and the most knowledge of that doctor. So all 3 of those things can break. We know that some states' medical boards are better than others, and just because a doctor is clean on the medical board doesn't mean a darn thing, right?
Right.
We know that there's an enormous problem with hospitals failing to report dangerous doctors to the data bank. So a clean data bank query isn't always reassuring.
Correct.
And then we know, at least from the Dunch case, that certain doctors were unwilling to speak openly negatively about Dunch for fear of their own, getting in trouble.
Right.
And so can you talk about those 3 things?
Sure. And so you're right. There are breakdowns. Sometimes there's a hospital that fails to report action. We send verification letters to all those hospitals. You really have to read those closely because those can be very telling. Like one in the Dunch case, it said they do not have any current investigations. Well, that's a flag for me. It's like, okay, what about pending? You didn't address, did they have pending ones or prior ones? And then you also want to be able, we have a lot of other information that we query and put the pieces together. So if a hospital fails, for example, to report to the National Practitioner Data Bank, state boards and malpractice carriers are pretty good about reporting. It depends on the time frame, but they are pretty good about reporting. It's hospitals where either there's a delay in reporting or a lot of hospitals just aren't educated on what they're required to report. And the education from the data bank is really geared toward the wrong audience. They need to be educating the physicians who have a duty to report and in-house counsel so that they're understanding exactly what they're required to report and when. So yes, there is a gap in that process as well because you don't know, and if something happened at a hospital, if they don't disclose it, and if they it's not reported on the data bank. And so you really have to do a deep dive into the history. You have to be able to get peer references, clinical evaluations. As I said, the person who they reported to is typically crucial. And we're seeing more and more because of the way that we phrase our questions and we clarify that, this is confidential and so forth. We're seeing a lot of physicians being more forthcoming in what they're willing to tell us. That way it does help us make a more informed decision.
Your job is hard because you have to rely on data to be accurate, and you have to rely on people to be morally and ethically right with you, straight with you. Okay. And, I've seen situations where, Dr. A is going to recommend Dr. B to get surgical privileges because Dr. A is an anesthesiologist. And if Dr. B doesn't get surgical privileges, then Dr. A, that's his cash cow. And so, you really, really got to turn over every rock. And unfortunately, I would trust you, but we just don't know that every rock's being turned over by all hospitals.
Right. Absolutely. And there's a lot of pressure with credentialing to get those files pushed through because they're in, the faster you credential somebody, the faster they're able to come on board, the faster they're able to see patients and bill. However, what we continuously teach, because I speak at a national level and I do consulting still, is you need to properly resource that department. You need to slow down and give them the time to really do the due diligence needed to dive deeply. one of the great things of doing this for as long as I have is I've seen how technology has tremendously helped. And it's really a lot harder now to hide things because you can really do a deep dive, even just Google searches, news searches, background checks. We now are able to dive into civil checks as well. And so it may be something as simple as, oh, they left a medical process and left medical records behind. So it's those types of things that does still speak to professionalism. And so with the advancement of technology, it's easier for us to gain information and to have a more comprehensive picture. But it's not perfect. And most of it is going to then be, once they're on board, making sure you have a thorough peer review process to really monitor them from the day they step foot into the hospital.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and with some hospitals, there's also a financial incentive because some of these medical specialties are cash cows. And especially a struggling hospital or a hospital that's trying to build a new, whatever it might be, a robotic surgery program, or they've built a new hospital and they've got to get it staffed up or whatever. Do you see that there are some hospitals who would take shortcuts because the administration has financial pressures?
well, I think we both know the answer to that.
Well,
I mean, especially with the Dr. Death case, that really brought it to light. But
didn't you learn that in law school? You don't ever ask a question that you don't already know the answer
absolutely,
to.
Absolutely.
Anyway, go ahead.
I would say that yes, unfortunately, that does happen. It does occur. I mean, healthcare is a business. Hospitals do have to look at their bottom line, and they have, there's patient care needs that have to be met. And so it doesn't excuse, however, putting profit over patient safety. And they have to really have that fine balance and making sure that if they know that they have a high recruit coming in, make sure they start the process earlier. Don't wait until the ninth hour to really, get the process rolling, but really back that process up so there is sufficient time to do thorough recruitment, thorough credentialing, so that you can make a more informed decision. But yes, unfortunately, there are hospitals that will push patients' profit over patient safety because they want to be able to get somebody in the door because they're high generating for revenue. However, in the long run, they end up, at times when they take that risk, they could be paying more in malpractice suits, brand reputation damage, and so forth because they took those shortcuts. So
Right. So when a physician does get hospital credentials, these are not like Supreme Court lifetime or a federal judge. It's not a lifetime appointment, right?
Right.
So can you describe the process of re-credentialing?
Sure. Well, for re-credentialing, so it's more of an ongoing process. And I know we'll get to peer review, but they go through their initial evaluation process, and then there's an ongoing process. So a lot of people focus on reappointment, which is where you get another application and you re-verify everything. But there's really an ongoing, continuous querying and monitoring process that occurs. And so, especially today with the technology and software, it is constantly monitoring all of their state licenses, and any disciplinary action that's going on, is that if we get an alert immediately should something occur. We also have OPPE, which is a part of peer review, where their performance is monitored on a regular basis based on internal data that is gathered. And so it's not really about reappointment anymore. It's more about that ongoing monitoring that is done on a continuous basis. And so we have clinical specialties that select service-specific indicators that are really meaningful for their clinical practice. And those in the department that's responsible for monitoring quality and performance, they're constantly looking at everybody's cases to say, okay, have they met the standard of care? Are they are they falling outside of the standard of care? Is there a trend or pattern? How are they doing with professionalism? Are we looking at patient complaints and grievances? And so that's more of an ongoing process. We are required to do a reappointment, which happens every 3 years. And that's where we do have a formal application where they complete disclosure questions again, that ask in-depth questions that they're required to say, no, I've not had any issues since my first appointment, or have you ever had any, criminal charges, have you any complaints, from other hospitals since the last time we were evaluating? And then we go back and we re-verify that information again. We get another clinical evaluation and we go back to each hospital and say, please confirm that they're still in good standing at your facility. The license is an ongoing verification. So it's really those hospital verifications, clinical evaluations, peer references that we're diving into, because everything else is more on an ongoing basis now. So.
Well, it's an interesting question, and my question is, how do you know if a doctor's lying? And we had a case where a doctor was arrested for drunk driving on his way to the hospital, and you're supposed to report that to the medical board.
Yeah.
And the doctor wasn't honest about it under oath either, as I recall. Aren't I supposed to say allegedly? But anyway, was allegedly drunk, may have pled guilty to that. But, it's like, how do you know if the doctor's being honest with you?
I don't know that there's a way that you can absolutely be sure that anybody's being honest with you, right? And so a lot of it is, that continuous monitoring. If somebody has been arrested, they are required to notify you immediately within 5 days, immediately for certain types of things like lapse of license, sanctions, their malpractice is dropped, any criminal sanctions, things like that, they have to do within 5 days because they might be in jail for a few days. And so they are required to notify us immediately of these types of things. And if they fail to do so, then we may not know about them until, it's time to run another background check, or, we hear about it through, the grapevine. A lot of the times there's, talk within the community, or sometimes, unfortunately, something hits the news before you find out about it.
Yep.
But then there's sanctions for that physician when we do find out about it. There are penalties that may lead all the way up to termination, depending on the severity of the issue. And so it is hard to really know at any given time what's going on in each practitioner or each individual's lives. But, we can just hope that they're being honest, and then we do our due diligence to make sure that we're verifying and staying on top of evaluating everything on an ongoing basis. So.
Right. Well, I want to talk, before we get to peer review, this is kind of a segue, and it's the quality assurance process. Because, we know that hospitals gather data and analyze data about individual physicians, and how does this physician compare to other physicians in our institution, and how do they compare against the measures nationally and things of that nature. And the measurements are based upon relevant data. Right. So like if it's a surgeon, you want to know about infection rate. You want to know about readmissions for surgeries. You want to know about postoperative complications. And these are probably things that every patient I know would also want to know. So talk about that data, if you would, and the privileges, the secrecy in which that data is kept.
Sure. So as you know, every state and federal law has privacy around peer review. It's called the peer review privilege. And unfortunately, for individuals, attorneys like yourselves, malpractice attorneys who are there to help patients, it's like this iron curtain that you're not able to get around. And it has to be the most frustrating thing, because you are trying to prove the case in order to help your patient. Like, what happened? There was an error. How did it occur? Did the hospital know about it? And what did they do about it? And so from that perspective, it can be frustrating. And yes, for patients, they of course want to know. On the flip side, if you look at it from a hospital's perspective, the privacy and the privilege really originated so that physicians could have open and candid conversations, so they can feel comfortable speaking up about their peers and quality or competency concerns that they're looking at. If something went wrong in a case, they need to be able to really dive into that and say, yes, this is what went wrong. this is a mistake that was made by a surgeon or anesthesiologist. The nurses, contributed to this. There were system errors. That way, if they're able to have those open conversations, that's how they really focus in on how do we prevent this from happening again to protect patients moving forward. And they also are able to then say, this individual is not going to practice in our hospital anymore, or they need additional education or training. And so if there wasn't that privilege, they probably wouldn't be able to, which is why it was implemented, they wouldn't feel confident and comfortable having those types of conversations to improve quality and patient safety in a hospital if they felt like they were going to then be liable for it, or if the other physician could then turn around and sue them and have that own liability on themselves as well. And so for peer review and that privilege, it is the iron curtain for malpractice attorneys, because it does help the physicians to really further quality of patient safety by being able to openly investigate without that fear of retribution or fear of lawsuits and personal liability.
Right. Yes. And I think, that's certainly understandable. But there's also measures that are tracked that, in my opinion, they should be available to patients. And you've heard me talk about this. You're probably tired of hearing me talk about it, but it's like, all of you can get a Consumer Reports magazine at the grocery store or whatever, and you decide, well, I'm thinking about buying a car. What's the crash worthiness? What's the fuel economy? What's the, whatever it is, a dishwasher, a microwave. And it seems to me that some of this data, it is what it is. But a patient, let's say I'm going to go in for a hysterectomy. I want to know, for me, because I've handled so many of these cases, I'm paranoid about it, but I would want to know, does this doctor have a higher than average incidence of bowel perforations? If I'm going in to have a hip replacement, I want to know, how does this surgeon compare for postoperative infections or revision surgeries? And as an informed consumer deciding which washing machine or car to buy or whatever, that would help me decide what doctor I wanted to choose. It may not be foolproof, but, I don't ever see that changing in my lifetime. Like you say, it's the iron curtain.
Right.
But there's so much that hospitals know that I feel like patients should know, but not going to happen.
I have a unique perspective on that because, as you know, I'm a patient as well.
Yep.
My families are patients, my friends, and they'll call me and they'll say, hey, can you look at this doctor? I'm going to in for this procedure. And I'd get just as nervous because I don't have access to that information when they're working in another hospital. And so I don't have that, inside knowledge into what their complication rates are and so forth. And so what another piece of my consulting or education and advocacy that I do is educating the public on what information they can look at. But yes, they're not going to be able to get complication rates. They're not going to be able to know whether or not a physician's had, a long history of malpractice suits. That information's not available to the public.
Yeah.
But there are things they can do. Is it as comprehensive as we would like? No.
Yeah.
But is it what we're, the hand that we're dealt right now? Yes. So for patients, what I try to educate friends, families, and others on, and I've done presentations on this at other organizations, is, you have the state boards, their information is available on their websites. So always look at the state board, because you can look at, one, you find out where were they trained. So, and usually you can also Google, was it a good training program? Did they have any state board actions? You can actually read what those actions were. And sometimes and doing a deep dive Google search, actually tells you quite a bit. And if you see they practice in other states, use keywords, for those states, and investigation or lawsuits, things like that. And you can really pull up quite a bit of information, which is kind of the minimum things that we do in credentialing, but we have, of course, full access. But there are things the public can do to gather as much information as they can But unfortunately, I'm with you. If I have to have a hysterectomy, I'd love to know that surgeon's complication rates. And, you know, like you, I review these cases and complications, and it is hard being a patient and not being able to have that information. So.
Yeah. Well, and as we know from the Dunch cases, you know, a lot of my clients did their due diligence and they went on the internet, and Dunch looked fantastic. And he was clean with the medical board, even though we knew there were news reports out there of patients that he had killed and maimed.
Yeah.
And yet, if you didn't happen to be watching that night's news, you wouldn't have known it.
Yeah.
But, you know, and I could go on with stories, but there's two sides to the coin.
Yeah.
Everybody calls me as well.
Mm-hmm.
Who should I go to? You know, what about this doctor? What about that hospital? And
I'm pretty sure I've called you before as well when I'm in Texas.
I don't know if you have or not, but, you know, I can say on the one hand, I have saved somebody from being put to sleep by an anesthesiologist I knew to have a drug problem. And I only knew about that because of the work that I do. Yeah. And I was like, well, you're going in for this procedure. Who's your anesthesiologist? And they were like, hold on, da-da-da-da-da. And I was like, pardon my French, but I was like, hell no.
Yeah.
No telling how many other people he had put to sleep, and I hope they were okay.
Right.
But on the flip side of it, I have to tell a funny story on myself, which is that a friend was going to have back surgery, and they were like, oh, I think there's only, with my insurance plan, I think there's only 3 I can choose from. And I said, well, copy that page out of your book, send it to me, whatever. And I was like, I don't know any of these doctors, but I'm an educated person. I know exactly what to look for. So I went and looked at their training. And I was like, oh, you know, this person was trained at Johns Hopkins or the Cleveland Clinic. This person, yeah, not so much. This person did a fellowship. This person didn't. But then I went one further and I called a spine surgeon friend of mine. And I was like, friend of mine's having back surgery. Here's what I think. You know, wouldn't you go with, you know, whatever it was, wouldn't you go with the Johns Hopkins trained, fellowship trained spine surgeon? And the other doctor was like, oh, bad hands.
Oh.
So like they didn't have like really super good finesse. Great on paper, but you know, who would have ever known that except another doctor?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is hard because patients don't have as much information as we would hope so that they can make an informed decision in regards to choosing a care provider.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, we don't want to scare people because most doctors, people ask me all the time, oh, you must hate doctors. And I was like, I certainly do not. I have some of my own doctors that I dearly love. And I respect the hell out of most doctors. Most doctors are very well trained. They're good people. They have good intentions. But of course, in my line of work, I see, you know, whatever the percentage is, I see the bad ones. And, you know, one thing I wanted to talk to you about is that one thing you look for is board certification. And being board certified doesn't mean that there aren't problems, but not being board certified in this day and age is a big red flag for you, right? And not being board certified by the relevant organization, not some fly-by-night, pay-to-play thing. So can you talk about that?
Sure. I'm going to touch on something you said first, though.
Okay.
So in my career, because you're right, and as a malpractice attorney, you see all of the bad. I will say that in my career, in my role, working in healthcare systems and thousands of doctors across the nation, I see a lot of great work. A lot of the most and the majority of the physicians and the practitioners that I've worked with, because I primarily work with physician leaders, their sole focus is on quality and patient safety, and they want to do what's best, and they want to make things better for the patients and education and make sure we have safe quality practitioners. But then yes, there are the, you know, bad actors that are out there. For board certification, it is an indicator. It's not a significant indicator in regards to does it speak to their quality, because you can have somebody who's board certified and they can be a surgeon that you still wouldn't want to go to.
Yeah.
But it is a level of quality that shows they've maintained their medical knowledge. Because by becoming board certified, it's like an attorney. You have to pass the bar to become licensed as an attorney. So we know that that level is high and the stringent process to go through. Just like a physician, to become certified, there is a significant process of completing tests, maintaining medical knowledge. But now there's this maintenance of certification process where they have to submit ongoing education and training. And so a lot of hospitals mandate that they have board certification now, because it does take that a step higher. And if somebody is not board certified, you have to stop and ask why. Why did you not were you not able to pass the boards? Why would you choose not to become board certified?
Right.
And so that is more of a red flag these days. They do have a certain window to become board certified after they finish training, of course. And some doctors have been in practice, for a long time. It wasn't required back in the day. But over the last, I think, 25, 30 years, then of course you're looking for a doctor who's board certified.
Yeah.
Or if they're trained, that they're pursuing board certification, they're still eligible. But board certified is a standard that most hospitals mandate.
Interesting. I can think back on the doctors that I've deposed who had multiple attempts to pass the board certification exams and they couldn't pass. They always say they have dyslexia or trouble taking tests. That's always the stock answer. I guess their attorney told them, say that. And I'm always like, interesting. How did you get through medical school if you're just not a good test taker or your dyslexia prevents you from getting board certified? But okay. Well, I want to talk about, with respect to the peer review committees, peer means peer. So a physician's peer is another physician. And so talk to us about how peer review goes from being truly a peer situation to going to the hands of the MBAs and the CEOs and business decisions are made instead of clinical decisions.
Sure. So I will say the peers that sit on those committees are probably the most critical individuals that are going to look at a practitioner's cases, because those are going to be more tenured physicians that have been chosen to sit on those committees, and they have a significant amount of responsibility on their shoulders to ensure that there is patient safety and quality of care being provided. And so whenever a case is sent to peer review, they're being scrutinized by physicians that have a lot of weight and responsibility for making sure that when they look at this case, they're really evaluating this physician's competency and what went wrong, and how do we make sure that it either doesn't happen again, we provide that level of education training needed, and how do we learn and change policies and procedures moving forward. And so they may be peers, and it's called peer review because it's physician to physician. It's somebody with the same, if it's anesthesiology, right, you're going to have a committee full of anesthesiologists, or if it's a multidisciplinary case, you're going to have multidisciplinary peers sitting on that committee. And so it's not like these are your friends most of the time. These are going to be physicians that are highly trained and qualified and are scrutinizing the care that was provided. And so all of the, whether it's the credentials committee that's scrutinizing their competencies, the peer review committees that's evaluating quality on an ongoing basis, those all roll up to the medical executive committee, which is the highest level of physician governance in the hospital. And these are physicians that have been elected by the medical staff. They're appointed into leadership roles. And that committee oversees everything related to peer review and credentialing, amongst other things, infection rates, infection control, and so forth. And then overseeing that committee and overseeing everything in the hospital is the governing body, whether it's board of trustees or the governing board. They oversee all aspects of the hospital, including medical staff, clinical practice, patient safety, and quality. And so ultimately, they are the final decision makers when it comes to approving a practitioner's initial or reappointment. Any disciplinary action ends up rolling up to them. So they are the final say. If a physician, for example, is terminated and goes through a hearing and they don't agree with those results, they can appeal, and that appeal goes to the board of trustees of the governing body. And so it goes hand in hand. The physicians, of course, are the key decision makers, the ones that are, are giving the board of trustees the information they know, so that helps them make an informed decision. But ultimately, those that sit on the board of trustees, not all of them, the majority of them are not physicians, so they have to rely on the information that's being given to them. But ultimately, it is the governing body's responsibility.
So, I know I've told you this story, but I had a surgeon contact me out of the blue. It's been many years ago now, but surgeon said, I'm a member of the peer review committee, and I sat on a peer review dealing with another surgeon. It was me, another surgeon, I think, and then they brought in a third party, an independent physician from the outside. They unanimously agreed that the surgeon was a clear and present danger to patients, that if the surgeon was allowed to go into the operating room, he was likely to hurt or kill someone. So they make their recommendation, strip his privileges, he's done. And, presuming that would also be reported to the data bank so that if the doctor tried to go to another hospital, that hospital would pick it up, whatever. So the one that calls me, the whistleblower, so to speak, he's going about his business. He's also has privileges at another hospital. He's operating. The anesthesiologist says, hey, I saw your buddy so-and-so the other day. And the whistleblower doctor says, where did you see him? And he's like, oh, he's practicing over such and such. And the doctor was like, you are kidding me. How is he practicing someplace else? So he goes to the hospital and marches up to the hospital administrator's office and, what the heck, what's going on? And that hospital administrator says, I make the final decision. And we let him resign. And they didn't report him. And to my guy, my whistleblower, and you better not create any trouble. You better keep your mouth shut. Well, that guy ends up getting run off from the hospital. They didn't like him making trouble. And so, I know that's an extreme but true story. Yeah. And so are you aware of there being a problem where the business people overrule the clinical people on these patient safety issues?
I would say it's extremely rare. I think as we said with those organizations that, look at revenue and profit over patient safety, it's unfortunate, but it's extremely rare. And I know that you know Bob Oshel. We've worked with him closely, and he looks at data bank reports, and I think there's 2, maybe 3% of cases where they've talked about what they call sham peer review, or a physician feels like they were wronged or they were run off, as you said, because they were being vocal. I don't see that happening often, frequently. I've personally never seen it directly outside of, the case that, we're both familiar with the Dunch case. But I think it's very rare that happens. Physicians have a strong voice. And one of my things that I do when I walk into an organization as a consultant is the first thing I do is I meet with their physician leaders, and I make sure they understand what their duties and their obligations are in regards to reporting, that they ultimately are the ones that have an obligation to report. So the American Medical Association has like these 10 sets of ethical standards, and one of those standards is that as a physician, you will uphold the integrity of your profession and you will report dangerous practitioners. And so I make sure they're educated first and foremost, but then also they understand that the attorneys, legal counsel, everybody in the hospital, they're there to help advise them, but the decision lies with them. But can they be overruled by the board of trustees? It's really not an administrator. It's supposed to be the board. But yes, in some cases, the bad cases that you hear about, which are very few, it can be a CEO or someone who says no, we're not doing that. We're going to let them resign. And, it's
Mhm.
typically for financial reasons and they don't want to be sued and go through the hassle of the hearing and so forth. But it's very unfortunate to hear when you do hear those things. But I do think it's not common. I think it's rare.
Mhm. Well, we do hear about these cases, and sometimes anecdotally, and sometimes because we read the news too, and we'll hear about something that happens here in Texas or in other states or whatever. And so I guess, my question for you would be, what keeps you up at night?
The things that I don't know. I think what keeps me up at night typically is going to be, when you do know that there has been an issue, a concern, a patient was harmed, and then waiting to say, okay, what what could have prevented this?
Mhm.
But then also knowing, okay, that is why we're here, is so that we can say, okay, could this have been prevented? What were the contributing factors and what can we make sure that we change to ensure it doesn't happen again. And so then what keeps me up at night is the fact that, like my sister called me and is about to have spine surgery in Washington State, and I can only do exactly what you did and look at where did they train and look at their license and so forth. And so the fact that we as a public don't have that internal information, even for myself, when I go to and at my own doctor, I don't have all of that information. I can only use, the information that's available to me to make that decision. But
Mhm.
I have no idea how many times they've had the same complication for the procedure that I'm going in for. So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've joked about this. There's multiple hospitals where I shouldn't darken the doors because they might try to kill me. They'll be like, "Oh, she's here. We hate her." But seriously, I do want to commend you, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I really, how I care about you, and I admire and respect you so much. You do an excellent job in the work you do, but you also spend a lot of your time educating other people with similar roles to yours, so that, a rising tide lifts all boats, as they say, and you're trying to bring the profession up so that all people do a better job and so that all of us are safer. And I just, and then our work that we do together for patient safety, I just can't thank you enough. I wish there was more people like you in the world. And I'm very honored that you come spend this time out of your busy schedule.
Well, I really appreciate that. I'm actually a selfless plug. Like I'm just was nominated and won an award called the Icon Award for raising awareness in my profession. And so, because I do spend a lot of time educating, I am very passionate about educating, those that work in a hospital or healthcare system, ambulatory surgery centers, to make sure they understand what they can do to make sure that they are bringing on board safe, quality providers, that they know how to do really thorough credentialing practices. And I teach and educate physicians on how to make sure they have a very thorough peer review process so that it is comprehensive and is focused on quality and patient safety in order to improve healthcare. So,
well, congratulations. Very well deserved.
thank you.
And thank you on behalf of all patients for what you do. And teaser alert, we hope to have you back for many future episodes. You and I never run out of things to talk about.
No, we do not. But I want to thank you, of course, for your partnership. Had it not been for your knowledge in regards to the field and helping mentor me and coach me through the work that you do, I wouldn't be as educated on the malpractice side as well, which definitely helps me in my role. So.
Well, it's a win-win.
It is.
Well, thanks so much, Ann.
Absolutely.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Kay. Thanks for having me.